The story of Roanoke does not begin with maps or kings or ships cutting across the Atlantic. It begins with silence, a silence so complete that it has echoed for more than 4 centuries. On a small, wind-brushed island off the coast of what is now North Carolina, an English colony vanished so thoroughly that even today, history struggles to explain where it went, why it left, and how an entire community could disappear without leaving behind the most basic traces of catastrophe. When Governor John White returned to Roanoke Island in August of 1590, he expected noise before he ever reached shore. Smoke from cooking fires, the sound of voices, the unmistakable signs of life. Instead, he was met by abandonment. The settlement he had left behind 3 years earlier, men, women, children, tools, homes, plans for permanence, was empty. Buildings had been dismantled, not destroyed. There were no bodies, no signs of battle, no evidence of starvation, no hurried messages scratched into wood in desperation. Only one word carved carefully into a post: Croton. This is where most retellings pause, presenting the word as a riddle that history simply failed to solve. But the silence of Roanoke is not empty. It is structured. It feels intentional. And that is what makes it unsettling. Colonies fail all the time in history. They fail loudly. They leave bones behind. They leave ash, weapons, scars in the ground. Roanoke left none of these. What it left instead was a void, an absence so precise that it raises a far more disturbing question than starvation or violence ever could. What if Roanoke did not collapse? What if it completed its purpose? The word lost has followed Roanoke for centuries, but lost things usually want to be found. Roanoke feels hidden. To understand why this disappearance feels different, one must step back into the late 16th century, a world where oceans were both highways and barriers, where information was power, and where secrecy was not an anomaly, but a survival strategy. England at this time was not simply exploring, it was maneuvering. It was competing against Spain, navigating religious conflict, espionage, and an undercurrent of forbidden knowledge that rarely appears in textbooks. Roanoke was not just England's first attempt at permanent settlement in a new world. It was an experiment, a gamble, and possibly something else entirely. The colony itself was small, vulnerable, and precariously placed. Supplies were thin. Relations with local tribes were complex. And yet, despite these challenges, nothing about the site suggested a sudden collapse. The settlers had time. Enough time to dismantle structures. Enough time to plan. Enough time to leave a message that was meant to be understood by someone. John White himself seemed unsettled not by what he found, but by what he did not. He had agreed with the colonists before leaving that if they were forced to abandon the settlement, they would carve a Maltese cross, a sign of distress. No such mark was found. Whatever happened at Roanoke, it was not viewed by the settlers as an emergency. This detail is often mentioned and then dismissed, but it deserves attention because it suggests consent, coordination, choice. And then there is the word itself. Croton was the name of a nearby island, and the people who lived there, yes, that is the simple explanation. But in an age of coded correspondence, symbolic language, and deliberate misdirection, simplicity is often a disguise. Elizabethan England was fluent in hidden meanings. Codes were not reserved for spies. They were embedded in politics, religion, navigation, and even art. What if Croton was not meant to say where the settlers went, but how they went, or who they were aligned with, or what they became? The disappearance of Roanoke sits at a strange intersection of history and myth. It is taught in classrooms as a mystery, but rarely explored as a possibility. Possibility is dangerous to established narratives. Possibility invites reinterpretation, and reinterpretation threatens comfort. Over the centuries, explanations have been proposed and discarded. Assimilation, massacre, famine, disease. Each theory attempts to resolve the discomfort of uncertainty by placing Roanoke neatly into a familiar category. But none of them explain the calmness of the departure. None of them explain the lack of evidence. None of them explain why this single failure was quietly abandoned by the English crown while future colonial disasters were meticulously documented. Roanoke feels less like an accident and more like a story that stops mid-sentence. And perhaps that is because it was never meant to be finished publicly. There's another layer to this silence, one that emerges only when we look at who funded the colony, who authorized it, and what else was happening behind closed doors in England at the time. The late 1500s were an age of secret societies operating in parallel with royal authority. Hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Rosicrucian thought, and the lingering influence of the Knights Templar had not vanished with medieval Europe. They had adapted. They had gone underground. Some historians dismiss these ideas as romantic speculation, but the people of the 16th century did not. For them, the boundary between mysticism and science was thin. Navigation itself relied on knowledge that bordered on the esoteric. Astronomy, sacred geometry, coded maps passed only to the initiated. The New World was not just land. It was opportunity, a place beyond papal control, beyond inquisitions, beyond kings who asked too many questions. If one wished to preserve something forbidden, knowledge, bloodlines, relics, or philosophies, the Atlantic was not an obstacle. It was protection. Roanoke may have been positioned at the edge of this threshold. The settlers were not random peasants. They were selected, skilled, literate. Some had connections to England's inner circles. And among them was Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World, a symbol of continuity, of inheritance, of something meant to last. Symbols mattered deeply in this era. And so the question becomes heavier, darker, and far more compelling. Was Roanoke ever meant to survive as a colony? Or was it meant to disappear? This documentary does not claim to offer a single definitive answer. Instead, it invites you into the silence, to listen to what history does not say, to examine the gaps not as failures of record, but as deliberate omissions. Because sometimes the most important events are not the ones that leave monuments behind, but the ones that vanish so completely they force us to ask why. As we move forward, deeper into records, maps, coded language, and suppressed histories, one thing becomes increasingly clear. Roanoke is not just a mystery of disappearance. It is a mystery of intention. And once intention enters the story, everything changes. For most people, the story of Roanoke begins and ends with a simple explanation. England tried to establish a colony in the New World. It struggled, and it failed. This version of events is neat, contained, and reassuring in its familiarity. History books summarize it in a few paragraphs. Teachers present it as an early lesson in the dangers of colonization, and documentaries often treat it as an unsolvable but ultimately unimportant mystery. According to the official story, Roanoke was lost because it was weak, underprepared, and unlucky. The standard narrative goes like this. In the late 1580s, England, eager to challenge Spanish dominance in the Americas, sponsored an experimental settlement on Roanoke Island. Sir Walter Raleigh, acting with royal approval, organized the venture. The settlers faced immediate difficulties: limited supplies, strained relations with local tribes, unfamiliar terrain, and the immense distance from England. When Governor John White returned to England for reinforcements, his journey was delayed by war with Spain. By the time he made it back, 3 years later, the colony was gone. The most reasonable explanation, historians say, is that the settlers either starved, were killed by hostile natives, or assimilated into nearby tribes. It is a story that sounds logical on the surface. Early colonies did fail. Supplies were scarce. The Atlantic crossing was dangerous and unpredictable. Communication delays were common. When help did not arrive, survival often depended on cooperation with local populations or desperation. From this perspective, Roanoke becomes an unfortunate but unsurprising footnote in the broader story of European expansion. But this explanation relies on assumptions rather than evidence. What is often overlooked is how quickly the official narrative was accepted, despite the lack of physical proof. There were no mass graves discovered on Roanoke Island, no burned structures suggesting an attack, no scattered weapons or armor. No personal items abandoned in panic. The settlement appeared orderly, dismantled rather than destroyed. And yet, the conclusion of failure was reached with remarkable speed. Historians frequently point to starvation as the most likely cause. Drought conditions have been identified in the region during that period, and food shortages were certainly possible. But starvation leaves traces. Desperate people do not carefully disassemble homes and take their belongings with them. They do not leave behind a single, deliberate word carved into wood. Starvation produces chaos, not silence. Another popular explanation is massacre. The idea that local tribes attacked and wiped out the settlers has lingered for generations, often reflecting more about colonial fears than historical reality. If such an event had occurred, there would likely be evidence, weapons, remains, oral histories describing a large violent encounter. Yet archaeological investigations have failed to uncover signs of such destruction. Even native oral traditions do not clearly support the idea of a violent annihilation. Assimilation is often presented as the most compassionate and plausible theory. The settlers, it is said, may have joined nearby tribes, intermarried, and eventually lost their English identity. This idea has even been romanticized, suggesting harmony between cultures. But assimilation on the scale required to erase an entire colony would have been notable. It would have left linguistic traces, cultural disruptions, or clear records in indigenous histories. Instead, what we find are fragments, vague references, and nothing conclusive. Despite these gaps, the official story remains largely unchanged. One reason for this may be convenience. History prefers explanations that fit established patterns. A failed colony fits neatly into the broader narrative of European trial and error in the New World. It does not require uncomfortable questions about intent, secrecy, or alternative motivations. It allows Roanoke to be categorized and filed away. Another reason may be the limitations of surviving records. Much of what we know about Roanoke comes from a small number of documents, many written years later. Some original reports are missing. Others are summarized or referenced indirectly. We are relying on a fragmented paper trail to reconstruct an event that may have been deliberately obscured. John White himself left surprisingly little behind. His writings are cautious, restrained, and lacking in speculation. He does not describe panic. He does not accuse. He does not push for a full investigation. After his return to England, Roanoke quietly faded from his life. There was no urgent royal inquiry, no sustained effort to locate survivors. England simply moved on. This is another detail the official story rarely addresses. Why was there no follow-up? When later colonies failed, England documented the reasons in detail. Jamestown, for example, was extensively recorded, analyzed, and mythologized. Its struggles became lessons. Roanoke, by contrast, became a curiosity. A story told but not pursued. Some historians argue that England lacked the resources or interest to search for the colonists. But this explanation feels thin. The loss of an entire colony was not a minor event. It represented a financial, political, and symbolic blow. Ignoring it seems inconsistent with England's ambitions at the time. The official narrative also tends to isolate Roanoke from the wider world. It is presented as a standalone event, disconnected from European politics, religious conflict, or the secretive currents of the Elizabethan court. Yet the late 16th century was anything but straightforward. England was navigating espionage networks, religious persecution, coded diplomacy, and shadow wars fought through proxies and exploration. In this context, it becomes harder to believe that Roanoke was simply abandoned to fate. The idea that the settlers vanished without guidance or planning assumes a level of chaos that does not align with the evidence left behind. The careful carving of Croton, the absence of distress signals, and the lack of destruction all suggest order. The official story struggles to reconcile these facts, often glossing over them rather than confronting their implications. It is also worth noting what the official story does not ask. It does not question why Roanoke was chosen as a location in the first place. It does not examine the backgrounds of the settlers in depth. It does not explore alternative motives beyond survival and trade. These omissions narrow the scope of inquiry before it even begins. By framing Roanoke as a simple failure, mainstream history effectively closes the door on more complex interpretations. It encourages us to accept uncertainty as unavoidable rather than interrogated. The mystery becomes passive, something to be acknowledged but not deeply examined. Yet history is rarely so simple, especially in an era defined by secrecy, symbolism, and power struggles beneath the surface of official actions. The official story of Roanoke offers comfort in its familiarity, but comfort is not the same as truth. It explains away the disappearance without truly explaining it. It resolves the mystery by labeling it unsolvable. As we move forward, it becomes necessary to set this story aside, not to dismiss it entirely, but to recognize its limitations. Only by stepping beyond the boundaries of the accepted narrative can we begin to explore the deeper currents that may have shaped what really happened at Roanoke. Because sometimes what history teaches us is not what happened, but what it decided was safe to remember. To understand Roanoke, one must first understand the world that sent it into existence. Elizabethan England was not merely a kingdom seeking land and resources. It was a nation navigating a labyrinth of hidden alliances, religious tension, espionage, and forbidden knowledge. The late 16th century was an age where power did not operate only through crowns and armies, but through symbols, codes, and secrets shared among a select few. Queen Elizabeth I ruled during a time of extreme instability. England was officially Protestant, but Catholic influence had not disappeared. Plots against the crown were constant. Spain loomed as both a military and ideological enemy, and the Vatican's reach extended through networks of informants and sympathizers. In such an environment, secrecy was not optional. It was essential. This was also a period when knowledge itself was dangerous. Certain ideas about the universe, about humanity's place within it, about ancient wisdom inherited from older civilizations, were considered heretical. Yet these ideas did not vanish. They went underground, preserved by scholars, navigators, and mystics who communicated in symbols rather than open declarations. Elizabethan England was deeply invested in this hidden world of knowledge. Astrology guided political decisions. Alchemy was funded by nobles. Sacred geometry influenced architecture and navigation. Mathematics, astronomy, and mysticism were not separate disciplines. They were intertwined expressions of understanding reality. Maps were among the most closely guarded secrets of the era. Cartography was not simply about geography. It was about power, knowing where land existed, how to reach it, and what lay beyond known horizons meant control over trade routes, resources, and strategic advantage. As a result, maps were often encoded, intentionally misleading, or restricted to inner circles. Public maps told one story. Private maps told another. This is the context in which the New World must be understood. To modernize, it appears as an unexplored frontier. But to some in Elizabethan England, it represented something far more specific, a space beyond oversight, beyond Rome, beyond traditional authority. A blank canvas where ideas and institutions suppressed in Europe could take root without interference. England's interest in the Americas was not purely economic. It was ideological. The New World offered the possibility of reinvention, not just of society, but of knowledge itself. For those operating within secret intellectual traditions, this was profoundly appealing. At the center of this hidden world were figures like John Dee, the Queen's advisor, mathematician, astrologer, and alleged magus. Dee was deeply involved in navigation, cartography, and imperial planning. He was also obsessed with ancient wisdom, angelic communication, and the belief that humanity had once possessed a higher form of knowledge that had been lost or deliberately suppressed. Dee and others like him believed that England had a divine or destined role to play in restoring this knowledge. Their vision of empire was not merely territorial. It was philosophical. Colonization, in this sense, was not only about land, but about preservation and continuation. This worldview shaped how exploration was planned and executed. Voyages were layered with meaning. Names were symbolic. Locations were chosen not only for practicality, but for alignment with celestial, geographic, and sometimes mythic considerations. To dismiss these influences as superstition is to misunderstand the mindset of the era. Secrecy also extended into politics. The Elizabethan court was a web of rival factions, covert operatives, and coded correspondence. Messages were written in cipher. Decisions were made in private councils. Official records often omitted uncomfortable truths or reframed events to serve stability. In such a climate, it becomes plausible that certain colonial ventures had dual purposes, one public, one concealed. What was announced as a settlement could also function as a relocation. What was described as failure could also be success if judged by different criteria. The Atlantic Ocean, often portrayed as a barrier, was in fact a corridor. Ships carried not just people and supplies, but information. Ideas traveled quietly, protected by distance and uncertainty. The further one went from Europe, the less oversight existed. This was freedom in its purest form, for better or worse. Elizabethan England understood this. It exploited it. There is also the matter of continuity. The medieval world had not vanished overnight. The dissolution of the Knights Templar in the 14th century did not erase their influence. It scattered it. Their traditions, symbols, and networks survived in altered forms, absorbed into new structures. Many scholars argue that elements of Templar ideology found refuge within emerging maritime powers, particularly those with an interest in navigation and exploration. Whether or not one accepts a direct lineage, the persistence of secrecy-oriented organizations is undeniable. Groups bound by oaths, symbolism, and selective knowledge thrived in environments where open expression was dangerous. Elizabethan England, with its religious instability and political paranoia, was fertile ground for such groups. This is why the official version of history often feels incomplete. It presents a surface narrative: who ruled, who explored, who settled, while ignoring the undercurrents that influence these actions. But history is not only written by victors. It is curated by survivors. Roanoke emerges from this environment not as an isolated colonial accident, but as a product of a deeply secretive age, an age where truth was layered and meaning was often concealed beneath plausible explanations. Understanding this changes how we view disappearance itself. In the modern world, disappearance suggests failure, loss, or chaos. In the Elizabethan world, disappearance could be a strategy, a way to avoid scrutiny, a way to protect something valuable. As we move deeper into the story of Roanoke, it becomes increasingly difficult to separate what was known from what was hidden. The age that produced the colony was fluent in misdirection. Silence was a language. Absence could be intentional. Elizabethan England did not simply stumble into the New World. It approached it cautiously, strategically, and with an awareness that some things were better left unseen. And in that context, Roanoke begins to look less like a mystery born of ignorance, and more like a deliberate act shaped by an age that understood the power of secrecy better than we ever could. To understand Roanoke beyond the surface, one must look closely at the man most closely associated with it, Sir Walter Raleigh. In mainstream history, Raleigh is presented as an ambitious courtier, a poet, an explorer, and a favorite of Queen Elizabeth I. He is remembered as a symbol of England's early imperial aspirations, bold, brilliant, and ultimately tragic. But this polished image hides a far more complex figure, one who operated comfortably in the shadows as much as in the light. Raleigh was not simply a sponsor of exploration. He was a man deeply embedded in the inner machinery of Elizabethan power. He moved easily between politics, espionage, science, and philosophy, inhabiting a world where information was currency and discretion was survival. His role in Roanoke cannot be reduced to financial backing or royal enthusiasm. He was a gatekeeper, someone who controlled access, knowledge, and purpose. Born into a well-connected family, Raleigh rose quickly at court, earning the Queen's favor through a mixture of charm, intellect, and calculated loyalty. But favor at Elizabeth's court was never accidental. Those closest to the Queen were often those who could be trusted with sensitive matters. Raleigh was entrusted with patents, monopolies, and colonial charters not simply because he was daring, but because he was discreet. Discretion was Raleigh's greatest strength. He was closely connected to John Dee, the Queen's advisor and one of the most enigmatic figures of the age. Dee was a mathematician and navigator, but also a devoted student of ancient wisdom, alchemy, and angelic communication. Raleigh moved in these same circles, where knowledge was layered and meaning often hidden beneath symbolism. Exploration, in this context, was not merely geographical. It was intellectual and spiritual. Raleigh's writings reveal a man deeply interested in ideas of destiny, empire, and hidden truth. He believed England was meant for greatness, but not simply through conquest. There was a sense common among certain Elizabethan thinkers that England had inherited a lost mission, one that traced back to ancient civilizations and sacred traditions suppressed by religious authorities. This belief matters when examining Roanoke. Raleigh did not personally sail with the settlers, but his involvement did not end once ships left England. He oversaw planning, selected leadership, and maintained correspondence. The people chosen for the colony were not random laborers. Many were educated, skilled, and capable of surviving beyond traditional European structures. This was not a haphazard group. The question that lingers is why. If Roanoke was simply an experiment in settlement, why entrust it to such a carefully curated group? Why involve individuals connected to England's intellectual elite? And why, after its disappearance, did Raleigh show so little public urgency to recover it? After John White's return and discovery of the abandoned settlement, Raleigh's response was muted. There was no aggressive search effort, no demand for answers, no attempt to salvage what was lost. This silence is often attributed to political distractions or shifting priorities, but silence itself can be meaningful. Raleigh was a man who understood the power of omission. Some historians suggest that by the time Roanoke vanished, Raleigh had already fallen out of favor at court, limiting his ability to act. But this explanation oversimplifies his influence. Even when his political standing weakened, his knowledge did not. Nor did his connections disappear overnight. It is also worth noting that Raleigh's life was marked by repeated accusations of secret dealings. He was suspected of atheism, involvement in clandestine intellectual circles, and later, treason. While many of these accusations were politically motivated, they point to a man who was perceived as operating beyond accepted boundaries. Raleigh's imprisonment later in life only deepens the mystery. In the Tower of London, he continued to write, think, and correspond. His works reflect a worldview shaped by deep skepticism toward official narratives and authority. He believed history was manipulated, that truth was often buried beneath layers of convenience. This perspective aligns uncomfortably well with the story of Roanoke. There is also the matter of timing. Roanoke was established during a period of intense pressure on England from Spain and Catholic Europe. Any venture that could draw attention, or worse, intervention, had to be handled carefully. If Roanoke served a purpose beyond colonization, disappearing quietly would have been far safer than drawing scrutiny through success. From this angle, failure becomes camouflage. Some alternative historians propose that Raleigh was involved in facilitating the relocation of people and knowledge away from Europe, using the New World as a sanctuary. Whether this sanctuary was physical, ideological, or symbolic remains debated. But the idea fits the pattern of a man who understood that survival sometimes required invisibility. Raleigh's coat of arms and personal symbolism have also attracted attention. Like many men of his era, he was deeply aware of heraldry, allegory, and encoded meaning. Symbols were not decorative, they were communicative. They signaled allegiance, belief, and identity to those who knew how to read them. In such a symbolic culture, a colony itself could function as a symbol. Roanoke may have been less about permanence and more about transition, a threshold rather than a destination. Raleigh's legacy is one of contradictions. He was celebrated and condemned, elevated and imprisoned, praised for his vision and punished for his ambition. He lived in a world where truth was negotiable and survival depended on knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. It is entirely possible that Roanoke was one of the things he chose not to speak about. By viewing Raleigh not merely as an explorer, but as a guardian of knowledge and intent, the story of Roanoke shifts. It becomes less about what went wrong and more about what may have gone exactly as planned. As we move forward, examining symbols, maps, and coded language, Raleigh's presence lingers in the background. Not as a failed sponsor, but as a figure who understood that some stories are meant to end abruptly, leaving behind questions rather than answers. Because in an age defined by secrecy, the greatest power was not discovery, but control over what was allowed to be known. Long before Roanoke, long before England ever dreamed of colonies across the sea, there existed an order whose disappearance reshaped European history, the Knights Templar. Officially, their story ends in the early 14th century, crushed by royal decree, accused of heresy, and erased from public life. But history has a habit of mistaking silence for extinction, and the shadow of the Templars did not vanish. It stretched, adapted, and moved quietly into places where power could survive unseen. To understand why Roanoke becomes entangled with Templar theory, one must first understand what the Templars truly were. Not merely warriors, but custodians. They were bankers, navigators, scholars, and guardians of knowledge accumulated during the Crusades. They traveled farther than most medieval Europeans, interacted with Islamic scholars, and absorbed mathematical, astronomical, and architectural knowledge far ahead of their time. This knowledge made them dangerous. When the Templars were arrested en masse in 1307, the speed and coordination of the operation suggested foreknowledge, but also fear. Kings do not destroy what they do not believe threatens them. Yet despite widespread arrests, much of the Templars' wealth, records, and leadership were never recovered. Ships vanished. Treasuries were empty. Documents were missing. The official narrative claims dissolution. The alternative narrative suggests dispersal. Many historians, even cautious ones, acknowledge that former Templars did not simply disappear. Some were absorbed into other orders. Others faded into civilian life. But a more provocative theory suggests that a core network survived intact, preserving its traditions by embedding itself within emerging institutions, particularly maritime ones. Navigation was freedom. The sea had no pope, no inquisitor, no fixed borders. For groups seeking autonomy, ships were sanctuaries. Centuries later, Europe entered the age of exploration, and strangely, many of the regions most deeply involved in early navigation, Portugal, Scotland, and later England, were places where Templar influence was rumored to have lingered longest. Symbols associated with the Templars began appearing on ships, maps, and coats of arms. Red crosses, 8-pointed stars, geometric motifs echoing sacred design. To modern eyes, these may seem coincidental. To people of the 16th century, symbols were never accidental. Elizabethan England inherited more than ships and ambition. It inherited fragments of a worldview, one that believed knowledge should be guarded, not shared, passed selectively, not openly. This philosophy aligns closely with what we know of Templar practice. The idea that the Templars may have reached the Americas before Columbus has long been dismissed by mainstream scholars, yet it refuses to disappear. Maps exist that depict land masses resembling the New World decades, or centuries, before official discovery. Legends speak of Western lands, rich and hidden, accessible only to those who knew the routes. If such knowledge existed, it would not have been shared with the public. It would have been guarded fiercely. Roanoke, when viewed through this lens, begins to feel less like a beginning and more like a continuation. The location itself raises questions. Roanoke Island was not the most fertile, defensible, or obvious place for a permanent colony. but it was accessible. It was discreet. It sat along established maritime paths. It could function as a waypoint rather than a destination. This aligns with how clandestine networks operate, not by drawing attention, but by blending into the expected. There is also the matter of ideology. The Templars were not loyal to kings in the traditional sense. They answered to a higher principle, one that transcended national borders. Their destruction came precisely because they had become too independent. Elizabethan England, especially factions operating beneath the crown, understood this danger. Knowledge had to be decentralized, protected through dispersion rather than concentration. What better place to disperse than a continent officially labeled new, but potentially known to a select few for generations? The settlers of Roanoke were not typical colonists. Some were craftsmen, some were scholars, some were families. This diversity suggests not merely labor, but continuity. A society in miniature, capable of adapting rather than conquering. And adaptation was the Templar way. The disappearance of Roanoke mirrors the earlier disappearance of the Templars themselves. No final battle, no dramatic ending, just silence, followed by centuries of speculation. In both cases, the absence of evidence becomes the evidence. Critics argue that linking Roanoke to the Templars relies too heavily on conjecture. But conjecture becomes compelling when patterns repeat. Secret orders do not announce themselves. They leave echoes, symbols, behaviors, omissions. One of the most telling parallels is the deliberate erasure of narrative. Just as Templar records were destroyed or altered, Roanoke's documentation is fragmentary. Letters missing, reports vague, follow-up minimal. It is as though history itself lost interest, an unlikely occurrence unless encouraged to do so. The idea is not that the Knights Templar, as medieval warriors, marched into the New World. Rather, it is that their philosophy survived, their method survived, their understanding of secrecy survived, and that understanding found new life in an age of oceans and empires. Roanoke may have been a test, a quiet experiment in relocation, transition, or preservation. A way to move people, ideas, and traditions beyond the reach of European politics without provoking suspicion. Failure is a convincing disguise. By labeling Roanoke a disaster, history closes the case. It stops asking questions. It moves on, and whatever lay beneath remains undisturbed. This is how secret knowledge survives, not through triumph, but through invisibility. As we continue deeper into maps, symbols, and coded language, the shadow of the Templars does not demand belief. It demands consideration. Because once one accepts that not all history is written for public understanding, Roanoke stops being an isolated mystery. It becomes part of a much older story, a story about survival through silence. In the modern world, maps are everywhere. They are precise, standardized, and openly shared. But in the 16th century, maps were power. They were secrets, guarded as closely as weapons or gold. To possess accurate knowledge of land and sea was to control trade, expansion, and survival. And because of this, not all maps were meant to be seen. Public maps told a simplified story. Private maps told the truth. During the age of exploration, European powers competed fiercely for geographic knowledge. Spain and Portugal led the way, but England followed closely, often relying on intelligence gathered through espionage rather than discovery. Captured ships, bribed cartographers, and stolen charts provided information that could not be obtained openly. This hidden exchange of geographic knowledge created a shadow map of the world, one that did not align neatly with official history. This is where Roanoke begins to feel less accidental. Some of the earliest maps of the Atlantic world depict coastlines with surprising accuracy long before they were supposedly explored. Certain landforms appear distorted, mislabeled, or deliberately obscured. Islands shift positions. Coastlines are exaggerated or minimized. These inconsistencies are often explained as errors, but not all errors are mistakes. Some are intentional misdirections. Cartographers of the time were well aware that their work could be stolen. To protect sensitive information, they sometimes inserted false details, phantom islands, incorrect scales, misleading names. These techniques allowed true knowledge to remain hidden in plain sight, accessible only to those who knew how to interpret it. The New World, in particular, was a landscape of competing truths. Officially, much of it was unknown. Unofficially, it was being studied, measured, and quietly claimed. There are maps predating Roanoke that suggest familiarity with the eastern coastline of North America beyond what official voyages would allow. Bays, inlets, and river systems appear with suspicious clarity. Some maps even include inland features that would have required exploration far beyond initial landing points. This raises a troubling possibility that parts of a new world were known earlier than admitted, and that Roanoke was not a blind gamble, but a calculated move based on pre-existing information. The choice of Roanoke Island itself reflects this. It was not the most obvious site for a settlement. The land was challenging, the waters dangerous, and supply routes difficult. But it was strategically placed, accessible from the sea, shielded from immediate detection, and connected to inland waterways that led deeper into the continent. In other words, it was ideal for movement rather than permanence. Some historians argue that early explorers underestimated the complexity of the American coastline. But sailors of the Elizabethan era were not ignorant amateurs. They were trained navigators, many with experience in secret routes, coded charts, and astronomical navigation. They did not sail blindly. Navigation relied on stars, geometry, and instruments that required specialized knowledge. This knowledge was passed selectively, often orally, and frequently kept within closed circles. A map alone was not enough. You needed to know how to read it. This brings us back to the idea of forbidden geography. Not forbidden by law, but by access. Certain places were known, but unspoken. Certain routes were used, but undocumented. To record them openly would invite competition, or worse, intervention. If Roanoke was part of such a hidden network, it would explain why its disappearance left so little trace. The colony may not have vanished in a chaos, but transitioned along routes that were never meant to appear in official records. There is also the question of inland movement. Traditional narratives assume the settlers stayed close to the coast, but maps of the period show awareness of vast interior regions. Rivers were highways. Indigenous trade networks connected far-reaching territories. European explorers, when allied with local guides, could move quietly and efficiently. A planned relocation inland would not require destruction or panic. It would require time, cooperation, and knowledge of where to go. The word croton, when viewed in this context, becomes even more intriguing. Rather than pointing to a single island, it may have indicated a network, a route, or an agreed-upon signal recognizable only to those who understood the map behind the map. Some alternative researchers suggest that Roanoke was never meant to remain visible. Its purpose may have been to establish presence, transfer people or materials, and then dissolve back into the landscape. A temporary node in a much larger system. This idea challenges modern assumptions about colonization. We imagine permanence, borders, ownership. But in the 16th century, flexibility was survival. Being able to move, adapt, and disappear was often more valuable than holding ground. Maps that supported this kind of mobility would not be shared publicly. They would be passed hand to hand, mind to mind, destroyed when no longer needed, altered to confuse outsiders. This could explain why so few definitive maps survive, and why those that do often contradict one another. The truth may have existed in layers, accessible only through combination. Map, instruction, and intent. The lost geography of the New World is not just about missing landmasses. It is about missing context. We are trying to interpret decisions made by people who lived in a symbolic, coded world using modern expectations of transparency. Roanoke's disappearance fits uncomfortably well with the idea of intentional obscurity. If the settlers moved along pre-known routes in areas already understood by a select few, there would be no reason to leave behind signs of struggle. No reason to mark graves. No reason to return. From the outside, it would look like failure. From the inside, it would look like completion. As we move forward, examining language, symbols, and bloodlines, the role of maps remains central. Not the maps we see in textbooks, but the ones that never survived. The ones that guided quiet movements and left no official footprint. Because sometimes, the most important journeys are the ones that never appear on any map at all. When John White stepped onto the abandoned shores of Roanoke Island and found the word Croton carved into a wooden post, history seized upon it as the sole surviving message of the lost colony. For centuries, this single word has been treated as a clue, simple, literal, and geographic. According to the official interpretation, it indicated that the settlers had moved to Croton Island, south of Roanoke, where a friendly native group lived. Case closed, many say. Mystery unresolved, but not especially complex. Yet this interpretation assumes something very modern. That people of the 16th century communicated plainly, especially in moments of crisis. That assumption does not align with the world Elizabethan England inhabited. This was an age of codes. Letters between nobles were encrypted. Maps hid meaning behind symbols. Religious belief was often expressed in allegory to avoid persecution. Even poetry functioned as layered communication, readable only to those trained to see beneath the surface. In such a culture, carving a single word into wood was unlikely to be accidental, spontaneous, or literal. Especially not that word. Croton was not merely a place name. It was a concept, a people, a network, and possibly a signal. To the uninitiated, it looked like direction. To those who understood the context, it may have carried a very different meaning. First, consider what is missing. John White and the settlers had agreed on a clear protocol. If the colony were forced to leave due to danger, they would carve a Maltese cross alongside any message. No such cross was found. This detail alone dismantles the idea of distress. Whatever Croton meant, it was not an emergency signal. The word was also carved carefully, not hastily. It was not scratched in panic or desperation. It was placed deliberately, as if meant to be found, and interpreted correctly. In coded communication, clarity to outsiders is often irrelevant. What matters is recognition by insiders. Elizabethan code systems frequently relied on shared reference rather than explanation. A single word could carry layered meaning depending on who read it. Religious dissidents used biblical names as stand-ins for real locations. Espionage networks used place names to refer to people, actions, or agreements. A name could represent an outcome, not a destination. So what if Croton was not telling White where the settlers went, but telling him that a plan had been executed? The Croton people were known allies of the English settlers. They were intermediaries, guides, and cultural translators. Their name could function as shorthand for alliance, integration, or protection. In this sense, carving Croton may have meant something closer to "we are under protection" or "the transition is complete." But the meaning may go even deeper. Linguistically, Croton does not fit neatly into English expectations. It is an adopted word, filtered through European ears, possibly altered in spelling and pronunciation. In Elizabethan usage, such words often took on symbolic meanings disconnected from their original source. The name could become a label, a cipher, or a marker. There is also the strange fact that the word Croton was carved on a post, not on a door or wall. Posts were markers. They signaled boundaries, transitions, and claims. A word on a post suggests not explanation, but designation. Some researchers have proposed that Croton functioned as a keyword, something that would make sense only to those already aware of a prearranged plan. In this interpretation, White did not pursue the colony because he understood exactly what the word meant, even if he never recorded that understanding publicly. This raises an uncomfortable question. Did White know more than he let on? White's own writings are cautious. He describes the discovery of the word, but he does not speculate wildly. He does not express shock at massacre or despair at loss. Instead, his tone is restrained, almost resigned. He intended to sail, to Croton Island, but was prevented by weather and circumstances. After that, the trail ends. No urgent follow-up, no renewed expedition. If Croton had been a desperate plea, would White have accepted its ambiguity so easily? Or does his calm suggest recognition rather than confusion? There is also the matter of repetition. The word Croton appears in multiple contexts surrounding Roanoke, sometimes as a people, sometimes as a place, sometimes as a concept. This repetition hints at symbolic significance beyond geography. In coded systems, repetition reinforces meaning. It establishes recognition. Some alternative historians have suggested that Croton may have functioned as a kind of password or clearance signal, a word that confirmed safe passage or successful integration into a hidden network, possibly inland, possibly along routes not meant for public record. This would align with earlier discussions of forbidden maps and secret geography. If the settlers moved along known but undocumented routes, leaving behind a simple geographic label would be sufficient for those who knew what it meant, while remaining meaningless to outsiders. There is also the unsettling possibility that Croton was not written for John White at all. It may have been written for someone else, someone who would arrive later, someone who knew exactly what to look for, someone who understood that seeing that word meant not to search further. In this sense, Croton becomes less a clue and more closure, a way of saying, this chapter is complete. This interpretation reframes the entire mystery. The problem has never been that we cannot interpret the word. The problem is that we are not the intended audience. Modern historians treat the carving as a puzzle meant for us to solve. But 16th century communication did not work that way. Messages were contextual. Meaning lived in shared knowledge, not in explanation. And when shared knowledge dies, messages become mysteries. There is a darker implication as well. If Croton was a code, then its survival suggests that other codes existed, ones that did not survive. Spoken instructions, symbolic agreements, maps never written down, understandings passed orally and deliberately left out of records. History, as we inherit it, is what remains after secrecy has done its work. The word Croton may be the only fragment that slipped through, not because it reveals the truth, but because it conceals it so well. As we move deeper into bloodlines, symbols, and legacy, this single word becomes less frustrating and more revealing. It shows us not what happened, but how people of the time thought about disappearance. They did not fear it. They planned for it. And in that planning, they left behind just enough to mislead those who came after, while saying everything that needed to be said to those who mattered. The mystery of Roanoke does not hinge on where the settlers went. It hinges on why they chose to tell us so little. Among all the unanswered questions surrounding Roanoke, one detail stands apart with quiet, symbolic weight: the birth of Virginia Dare. She was the first English child born in the New World, arriving in August of 1587, just days after the colonists settled on Roanoke Island. In mainstream history, she is often treated as a footnote, a curiosity, a trivia answer. But symbols matter, especially in the 16th century, and Virginia Dare was a symbol of immense significance. In an age obsessed with lineage, inheritance, and destiny, the birth of a child was never just personal. It was political. It was spiritual. It was symbolic of continuity. Virginia Dare represented something unprecedented, an English bloodline rooted not in Europe, but in the New World. She was not an explorer who arrived later, nor a conqueror who claimed land by force. She was born into it. That distinction would have carried profound meaning to people who believe history unfolded according to divine patterns and ancestral cycles. Elizabethan England was deeply conscious of bloodlines. Royal succession, noble legitimacy, and even religious authority were all tied to ancestry. The idea that a new lineage could be established beyond the reach of European power structures would not have gone unnoticed, especially among those who believed that certain bloodlines carried symbolic or even sacred importance. This is where the bloodline hypothesis emerges. Some alternative historians suggest that Roanoke was never intended to function solely as a colony. Instead, it may have served as a vessel, a way to transplant people, families, and genetic continuity into a space free from the conflicts consuming Europe. In this interpretation, Virginia Dare was not incidental. She was central. The fact that she was born to Ananias Dare and Eleanor White, both connected to the colony's leadership, only deepens the intrigue. She was not the child of anonymous settlers. She was connected to governance, planning, and authority. In symbolic terms, she represented the future embodied. In medieval and early modern thought, bloodlines were believed to carry more than biology. They carried memory, destiny, and legitimacy. This belief was not limited to royalty. It extended into esoteric traditions, including those associated with Grail lore, the idea that certain lineages preserve sacred knowledge through descent rather than doctrine. Within this framework, relocation was a method of preservation. When knowledge or lineage was threatened, it could be moved, hidden, or integrated elsewhere. Europe in the late 16th century was not safe for unconventional ideas. Religious persecution, political instability, and centralized authority made deviation dangerous. The New World offered distance. Distance meant protection. Virginia Dare's birth marked the moment when an English lineage could begin without European baggage. No feudal obligations, no papal oversight, no inherited enemies. This was not just colonization, it was rebirth. The disappearance of the colony shortly after her birth becomes more unsettling in this context. If the settlers were simply struggling to survive, the presence of infants would have made relocation nearly impossible. Yet the absence of distress suggests planning, not desperation. Children are not moved in panic. They are moved with intention. Some theories propose that the settlers integrated into native communities, and that Virginia Dare lived out her life under a different name, her lineage blending quietly into the land. This idea has been romanticized, but it also carries strategic logic. Integration would ensure survival without attracting attention. A lineage could persist invisibly. Others suggest a more deliberate preservation, that Virginia Dare and other children were raised within controlled environments, their identities obscured to protect them from political exploitation. In an age where bloodlines could be weaponized, anonymity was safety. It is also worth considering how little we know about the children of Roanoke. Adults leave records. Children vanish into silence. If the colony's purpose involved long-term continuity rather than immediate success, the children would have mattered most and been documented least. The bloodline hypothesis does not require belief in supernatural destiny. It requires only an understanding of how early modern thinkers viewed inheritance. To them, blood was history. It was continuity made flesh. The fact that Virginia Dare's fate is completely unknown is not a failure of record. It may be the point. Over the centuries, stories emerged among local populations of pale-skinned ancestors, gray-eyed children, and families who trace their origins to mysterious outsiders. Mainstream historians often dismiss these accounts as folklore. But folklore is memory shaped by survival, not archives. When written history is silent, oral history fills the gap. What is striking is how persistently Virginia Dare reappears in American imagination. She became a symbol of innocence, loss, and beginnings. Artists painted her. Writers mythologized her. Yet no one could say where she went. Symbols have power precisely because they resist closure. If Roanoke had been a straightforward tragedy, Virginia Dare would have been memorialized as a victim. Instead, she became a question, a presence without a conclusion. This ambiguity mirrors Grail legends, where the object of focus is not destroyed, but hidden. The Grail is never lost. It is removed from reach until the right conditions return. Bloodline theories often accompany these legends, emphasizing descent over possession. Whether or not one accepts a direct connection, the structural similarity is difficult to ignore. The disappearance of Roanoke shortly after the symbolic birth of a New World lineage feels deliberate, as though the moment was marked and then the stage was cleared. From this perspective, Roanoke did not fail. It transitioned. The colony dissolved into something less visible, but potentially more enduring. Virginia Dare, as an individual, may have lived an ordinary life. Or she may have been raised with awareness of her significance. Or she may have simply blended into the land, her story surviving only through blood and memory. But as a symbol, she represents the core question of Roanoke. Was the colony meant to be remembered, or was it meant to disappear so something else could survive? The bloodline hypothesis does not demand certainty. It invites reflection. It asks us to consider that history is not only shaped by battles and treaties, but by births, disappearances, and choices made quietly for the sake of the future. And in that quiet, Virginia Dare remains, not as a lost child, but as a living echo of a decision history was never meant to explain. When historians speak of mysteries, they often focus on what is present: anomalies, strange artifacts, conflicting accounts. Roanoke is different. Its mystery is defined by what is missing. Not just people, but evidence. Not just answers, but the very signs that something went wrong. This absence is not passive. It is active, and it demands explanation. In nearly every historical disaster involving settlements, certain patterns repeat themselves. There are remnants of violence or signs of desperation. Structures are damaged or burned. Tools are abandoned. Human remains are found, even centuries later. Roanoke offers none of this. It is as though the colony simply stood up and walked away, taking its identity with it. Archaeological investigations of Roanoke Island have been extensive. Researchers have searched for graves, weapons, household items, and signs of sudden departure. What they have found instead is order. Buildings have been dismantled, not destroyed. Valuable items were not scattered. There is no evidence of hasty flight. This detail alone challenges the most common explanations. If the settlers had been attacked, there would be evidence of struggle. If they had starved, there would be signs of desperate improvisation. If disease had wiped them out, there would be mass burials or abandoned belongings. None of these appear. The land is quiet in a way that feels intentional. The absence of panic is perhaps the most unsettling aspect. People under threat do not pause to dismantle homes. They do not take the time to remove doors, salvage timber, and clean the site. These actions require planning, cooperation, and a sense of safety. They suggest that the settlers believed they were moving towards something, not fleeing from something. The official narrative struggles here. It attempts to compress Roanoke into familiar categories, but the evidence resists classification. This resistance is often dismissed as the result of time, erosion, or incomplete excavation. But even allowing for centuries of decay, the lack of disturbance remains striking. Then there is the timeline. John White left Roanoke in 1587 and did not return until 1590. 3 years passed. In that time, countless things could have happened. But when he arrived, he found no layers of occupation, no signs of gradual decline. The site did not look lived in and abandoned over time. It looked deliberately cleared. This suggests that whatever happened occurred relatively quickly and with coordination. The settlers had agreed on a clear system of communication. A Maltese cross would indicate danger. None was found. This means that the departure was not perceived as forced. That detail is often mentioned, but rarely examined for its full implication. If the colony left voluntarily, then the question is not what destroyed them, but what called them away. Another overlooked detail is the lack of scavenging. Abandoned settlements are typically looted by animals, by other humans, by time itself. Yet Roanoke did not show signs of such intrusion. It was as if the site had been intentionally rendered uninteresting, stripped of anything worth taking. This could suggest that the settlers anticipated returning, or that they intended the site to be forgotten. The idea of disappearance as strategy is uncomfortable for modern historians. We are conditioned to view disappearance as loss or failure. But in earlier eras, disappearance could be a tool, especially for groups seeking autonomy or protection. Consider how often secrecy appears in survival narratives. Religious minorities moved quietly to avoid persecution. Political dissidents vanished into exile. Knowledge was hidden in allegory and myth. Entire communities relocated without leaving written records, precisely because records could be used against them. Roanoke may belong to this tradition. There's also the matter of scale. An entire colony does not vanish by accident. Even small groups leave traces. The more people involved, the harder it is to erase evidence. That Roanoke left so little suggests a level of control inconsistent with chaos. Some have argued that the settlers assimilated into local tribes, gradually losing their European identity. While possible, assimilation on this scale would still leave archaeological footprints, foreign tools, altered settlement patterns, hybrid artifacts. Yet evidence remains sparse and ambiguous. This ambiguity has led some researchers to consider inland movement. Rivers provided access deep into the continent. Indigenous trade networks spanned vast distances. With cooperation and guidance, the settlers could have relocated far from the coast, leaving behind little that would draw attention. If this relocation was planned, it would explain the lack of distress and the careful dismantling of the settlement. It would also explain why no rescue effort followed. There may have been nothing to rescue. The idea that Roanoke was a temporary installation rather than a permanent colony reframes everything. Temporary sites are meant to disappear. They're designed to leave minimal trace once their purpose is fulfilled. This concept aligns uncomfortably well with the evidence. There's also the psychological aspect to consider. John White's reaction was not one of alarm, but of subdued confusion. He did not describe terror or devastation. He did not insist on immediate investigation. Instead, he noted what he found and then returned to England. The matter faded. This response feels disproportionate to the loss of an entire community, unless that loss was anticipated. History often treats White as a tragic figure who failed his people. But what if his role was never to save them? What if his task was to oversee a transition, not a rescue? This is speculation, yes, but it is speculation grounded in absence rather than imagination. The disappearance of Roanoke challenges the assumption that all historical events are accidental. Some events are designed to look accidental. Some are meant to resist explanation. The more one examines Roanoke, the more it resembles a controlled vanishing, a phenomenon seen not only in history, but in intelligence operations, religious migrations, and secret societies. Disappearance leaves no enemy to fight, no blame to assign, no trail to follow. It is the cleanest exit. Modern archaeology is excellent at uncovering what remains. It struggles with what was removed. If Roanoke was intentionally erased, then its success lies precisely in the fact that we are still searching for it. The absence becomes the story. The lack of evidence becomes the message. As we move closer to theories of underground networks and hidden settlements, this disappearance takes on new meaning. It becomes less a mystery to solve and more a demonstration of how effective secrecy can be. Roanoke did not collapse into the past. It slipped sideways into a space history does not easily reach. And that may have been the point. As the mystery of Roanoke deepens, one theory begins to emerge as a connective thread, one that ties together secrecy, planning, disappearance, and silence. This is the idea that Roanoke was not an isolated settlement, but part of a broader, largely invisible network. Not underground in the literal sense of tunnels and hidden chambers, but underground in the way secret systems operate, unseen, undocumented, and deliberately obscured from official history. To modern ears, the phrase underground network may sound dramatic or implausible, but in the context of the 16th century, networks were the foundation of survival. Trade routes, religious movements, intelligence operations, and knowledge transmission all depended on informal systems that existed beyond official oversight. These networks relied on trust, symbols, oral communication, and shared purpose rather than written records. The New World was perfectly suited for such a system. Indigenous trade networks already spanned vast distances across North America long before Europeans arrived. Rivers functioned as highways, connecting inland regions to the coast. Knowledge of terrain, seasons, and safe passage was passed orally, refined over generations. When Europeans arrived, they did not enter an empty land. They entered a living web of movement and exchange. If the Roanoke settlers had access to even a fraction of this network, relocation would not only have been possible, but efficient. This challenges the assumption that early settlers were helpless without European supply lines. Survival did not require isolation. It required integration, quietly, selectively, and with guidance. The underground network hypothesis suggests that Roanoke functioned as a surface node, a visible entry point. Its role was not to grow indefinitely, but to connect people, resources, and intent into a deeper system already in motion. Once that connection was established, the surface node could disappear. This idea aligns with how secret operations function even today. Visibility attracts attention. Attention invites interference. Disappearance ensures continuity. The settlers of Roanoke were not merely laborers or soldiers. Many were skilled artisans, builders, and individuals capable of adapting to new social structures. Such skills would have been invaluable in inland settlements operating outside European control. These are people who could blend, build, and endure. There is also the question of coordination. Moving an entire colony, including women and children, requires planning. Routes must be known. Destinations must be prepared. Supplies must be distributed. This level of organization does not emerge spontaneously in moments of crisis. It suggests prearrangement. Supporters of the underground network hypothesis point to subtle clues: the absence of distress signals, the careful dismantling of structures, the single coded word left behind. These are not the marks of collapse. They are the marks of execution. Execution of a plan. One possibility is that Roanoke's settlers dispersed rather than relocated as a single group. Small units could have moved along different routes, integrating into multiple inland communities. This would reduce visibility and risk, ensuring survival even if one group failed. Decentralization is a hallmark of resilient networks. Another possibility is that Roanoke was linked to earlier, undocumented European presence in the Americas. Fishing fleets, traders, and explorers had likely reached North American shores long before official records acknowledge. These visits may not have resulted in permanent colonies, but they could have established contact points, places where knowledge was exchanged and relationships formed. If such contact points existed, Roanoke could have been designed to reconnect with them. This would explain why England showed little interest in reclaiming the colony. From the outside, it appeared lost. From within the network, it was absorbed. The underground network hypothesis also accounts for the absence of written records. Writing creates vulnerability. Documents can be seized, altered, or used as evidence. Oral systems, by contrast, leave no trace once participants are gone. In an age of political paranoia and religious persecution, silence was security. It is important to note that this hypothesis does not require a single centralized authority directing events. Networks do not need leaders in the traditional sense. They operate through shared understanding and mutual benefit. A plan does not need to be written down to be followed. Symbols, agreements, and trust are enough. The role of indigenous communities in this network is crucial. Too often, history portrays Native peoples as passive participants in European narratives. In reality, they were skilled diplomats, traders, and strategists. They understood the land in ways Europeans never could. Any successful inland movement would have required their involvement. This does not mean domination or deception. It means cooperation. Such cooperation would also explain why archaeological evidence remains elusive. Integration leaves fewer traces than conquest. Shared spaces evolve organically, not abruptly. Over time, distinctions blur. This hypothesis reframes Roanoke not as a story of European failure, but as an example of adaptation. The settlers did not impose themselves violently or stubbornly cling to foreign structures. They adjusted. They merged. They vanished as colonists and reappeared as something else. And that transformation would have been invisible to those expecting European markers of success. The idea of underground networks also sheds light on why Roanoke occupies such a strange place in historical memory. It is remembered, but not resolved, mentioned, but not pursued, as though history itself hesitated to look too closely. This hesitation may not be accidental. When events challenge dominant narratives, they're often minimized rather than explored. A colony that failed fits expectations. A colony that deliberately disappeared does not. As we move forward, examining oral traditions, suppressed evidence, and long-term implications, the underground network hypothesis becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss. It offers a framework that accommodates the evidence without forcing it into familiar molds. Roanoke may not have vanished into nothingness. It may have vanished into continuity. And if that is true, then its true legacy is not absence, but survival achieved through invisibility. When written records fall silent, history does not end. It simply changes its language. In the case of Roanoke, European documents fade quickly, offering little more than speculation and absence. But silence in one tradition does not mean silence in all. Beyond ink and parchment lies another archive, one preserved not in libraries, but in memory. Native oral traditions, passed from generation to generation, offer fragments of a story that was never meant to be written down. Oral history operates differently from written history. It does not aim for dates, signatures, or official approval. It preserves meaning rather than chronology. It survives because it adapts, reshaping itself to remain relevant while retaining a core truth. For cultures whose survival depended on memory rather than documentation, oral tradition was not inferior. It was essential. European historians have often dismissed oral traditions as unreliable, symbolic, or mythic. Yet these same historians routinely accept medieval chronicles filled with allegory, superstition, and political bias. The difference is not accuracy, but familiarity. When we turn our attention to native accounts from the regions surrounding Roanoke, a pattern begins to emerge, one that does not confirm a massacre or a tragic collapse, but something quieter and more complex. Several tribes in the southeastern region have preserved stories of outsiders who arrived from the east, lived among them, and eventually became indistinguishable from the local population. These outsiders are often described as pale, bearded, or possessing unfamiliar tools. Importantly, they are not always portrayed as invaders. In many stories, they are refugees, learners, or allies. This distinction matters. The tone of these accounts is not one of conquest or resistance, but of integration. The outsiders are absorbed, not defeated. They adapt to local ways, adopt new identities, and disappear as a separate people. This aligns uncomfortably well with what we see, or rather, do not see, at Roanoke. Some oral traditions speak of villages where European features appear generations before sustained colonial contact. Gray eyes, unusual hair colors, certain building styles. These details are often dismissed as coincidence or later influence, but their persistence raises questions. Oral traditions are not concerned with proving themselves to outsiders. They exist to preserve meaning for insiders. When such traditions mention the arrival of strangers who became kin, they are not attempting to document an event for historians. They are preserving a memory of transformation. Transformation is a recurring theme. In many indigenous stories, identity is fluid. A person becomes what they live as, not what they arrived as. Names change. Roles change. Belonging is earned through participation, not blood alone. From this perspective, the idea that the Roanoke settlers could have disappeared by becoming part of native communities is not disappearance at all. It is continuity. What makes these accounts especially compelling is their consistency with absence. They do not describe dramatic endings. There are no stories of great battles with English settlers, no legends of mass death. Instead, there's stories of quiet arrival, adjustment, and blending. This absence of violence mirrors the archaeological record. Critics argue that oral traditions are too vague to be reliable. But vagueness is not the same as falsehood. Oral histories often avoid specifics because specificity limits adaptability. What matters is not when something happened, but how it was understood. And how it was understood matters greatly. In some traditions, the arrival of outsiders is framed as fulfillment rather than disruption, as if the land expected them, as if their coming was part of a larger pattern. This language may sound symbolic, but symbolism was the language of the era, on both sides of the Atlantic. It is also worth noting what indigenous oral traditions do not say. They do not speak of a sudden influx of English power in the Roanoke region. They do not describe a failed colony begging for survival. They do not record a catastrophe that would have echoed through generations. Silence can be testimony. European historians often assume that if something significant happened, it would have been written down. But this assumption ignores the realities of power. Writing was controlled. Literacy was restricted. Records were curated. Oral traditions were free from this control. They could preserve uncomfortable truths without fear of censorship. They could remember events that official history preferred to forget. This is why oral traditions are often richest where written history is poorest. They fill the gaps left by omission. The integration hypothesis gains strength here. It suggests that Roanoke's settlers did not vanish into oblivion, but into story. Their descendants may not have identified as English. Their names may have changed. Their accents disappeared, but memory of their arrival remained. Over time, as European colonization intensified, these blended communities would have been absorbed again, this time into colonial narratives that erased earlier, quieter integrations. The story of Roanoke would be overwritten by louder histories of conquest and settlement. Yet echoes remained. Some tribes maintained unusual relationships with later European settlers, acting as intermediaries, guides, or translators. While this can be explained pragmatically, it also hints at earlier familiarity. Trust does not appear overnight. It is built. The reluctance of mainstream history to engage seriously with oral traditions is telling. Oral history resists control. It cannot be footnoted easily. It does not conform to academic structure. But that does not make it meaningless. It makes it inconvenient. Roanoke is inconvenient. It sits between categories. It refuses to be a clear tragedy or a clear success. Oral traditions help explain why. They do not resolve the mystery, but they shift its center. Instead of asking, what destroyed Roanoke, we begin to ask, what did Roanoke become? This is a far more unsettling question, because if the settlers survived by integrating, then Roanoke did not end in 1590. It continued in blood, memory, and land. It continued without leaving monuments or records. It continued in a way history struggles to recognize. The things not written down are often the most enduring. As we move toward examining suppression, missing evidence, and deliberate amnesia, native oral traditions remind us of a crucial truth. History is not owned by those who write it. It is lived by those who remember. And sometimes, remembrance takes a form we are not trained to read. At a certain point in the investigation of Roanoke, the mystery stops feeling accidental. Too many documents are missing. Too many questions go unanswered. Too many opportunities for clarification were simply ignored. This is where the story shifts from disappearance to forgetting. Not the natural fading of memory over time, but something closer to deliberate amnesia. History does not forget equally. Some events are preserved obsessively, documented from multiple angles, revisited endlessly. Others vanish almost immediately, leaving behind only fragments. Roanoke belongs firmly in the second category, and that alone should raise suspicion. The disappearance of an entire English colony in the New World should have triggered alarm. It should have resulted in investigations, reports, follow-up expeditions, and political consequences. Yet within a remarkably short time, Roanoke slipped into obscurity. England moved on. The Crown redirected resources. New colonies were planned as if nothing had happened. This response is difficult to reconcile with the priorities of the Elizabethan state. Colonization was expensive. It was risky. It was politically sensitive. Failure carried consequences. And yet Roanoke's failure, if that is what it was, produced no visible fallout. No major inquiry. No public reckoning. No sustained effort to recover survivors or uncover the truth. This silence is not neutral. One explanation often given is distraction. England was at war with Spain. Resources were limited. Attention was elsewhere. While this is partially true, it does not fully explain the lack of curiosity. Even during wartime, information mattered. Knowing whether a colony had been destroyed, absorbed, or relocated would have been strategically valuable. Unless the answer was already known. Many of the original documents related to Roanoke are either missing or incomplete. Letters referenced by later writers no longer exist. Reports are summarized rather than reproduced. Gaps appear precisely where clarity would be most useful. Missing records are not uncommon in early modern history, but patterns matter. When loss consistently favors ambiguity over explanation, one must ask whether loss is the correct word. There is also the issue of narrative framing. Early accounts of Roanoke are oddly restrained. They do not dramatize the event. They do not dwell on suffering. They present the disappearance almost as an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. This tone shapes how later historians approach the subject. By minimizing emotional weight, the story is easier to set aside. Convenient amnesia is not the same as conspiracy. It does not require secret meetings or coordinated deception. Often, it emerges from shared incentives. If remembering something creates discomfort, risk, or complication, forgetting becomes attractive. Roanoke posed questions that England may not have wanted to answer. What if the settlers had integrated with native communities? This would challenge narratives of European superiority and separation. What if they had moved inland beyond crown control? This would complicate claims of authority. What if Roanoke had fulfilled a purpose that was never meant to be public? This would raise uncomfortable questions about intent. In each case, forgetting is easier than explaining. Later colonial efforts benefited from Roanoke's silence. Jamestown could be framed as a fresh start, unburdened by the ambiguity of earlier experiments. The myth of failure cleared the ground for new narratives of perseverance and triumph. Roanoke became a cautionary tale rather than an unresolved chapter. There is also the matter of suppression through classification. By labeling Roanoke a mystery, history effectively neutralizes it. Mysteries are entertaining but non-threatening. They invite curiosity without demanding revision of established frameworks. A mystery does not require action. It requires only wonder. Suppression does not always mean destruction of evidence. Sometimes it means framing evidence in a way that limits its impact. Archaeological finds are interpreted conservatively. Oral traditions are marginalized. Alternative theories are dismissed as speculative. Over time, this creates a self-reinforcing loop. The absence of accepted evidence justifies further dismissal. The dismissal ensures no new evidence is seriously considered. This is how amnesia becomes institutional. It is also important to consider who benefits from forgetting. Empires depend on clean narratives. Ambiguity undermines authority. A colony that vanished on its own terms disrupts the idea that history moves through conquest and control. Roanoke suggests something else: choice. Choice undermines hierarchy. The Elizabethan world was deeply hierarchical. Authority flowed downward. Colonies existed to extend power, not escape it. A colony that chose disappearance over visibility challenges the entire premise of empire. It is easier to forget such a story than to confront it. Even modern scholarship reflects this discomfort. Roanoke is often treated as an outlier, a puzzle with no solution, rather than a case study in alternative outcomes. Few historians ask what Roanoke might reveal about early colonial strategy beyond failure. This reluctance is telling. The concept of suppressed evidence does not require malicious intent. It requires only alignment of interests. When forgetting benefits everyone involved, from monarchs to merchants to historians, forgetting becomes inevitable. And once forgetting takes hold, recovery becomes nearly impossible. Documents lost centuries ago cannot be rediscovered. Voices silenced by time cannot be interviewed. What remains are traces, and traces are easy to ignore. Yet traces persist. They persist in the gaps between records, in the odd calmness of official accounts, in the absence of follow-up, in the way Roanoke feels unfinished, not unresolved. Convenient amnesia does not erase events. It blurs them until they lose their ability to challenge. As we approach the most provocative interpretations of Roanoke, it becomes clear that suppression may not have been about hiding a crime, but about protecting a transition. Whatever Roanoke became, it was not meant to be integrated into the public story of empire. It was meant to fade, and in that fading, it succeeded. The greatest illusion of history is that what we remember is all that mattered. Roanoke reminds us that what we forget may be far more important, because forgetting is rarely accidental. It is often the final step of a plan carried out long before anyone thought to ask questions. At the far edge of the Roanoke mystery lies a theory that refuses to stay buried, no matter how often it is dismissed. It is not comfortable. It is not easily proven, and yet it persists because it connects too many loose threads to be ignored. This is the idea that Roanoke was not merely a colonial experiment, but part of a much older movement, one rooted in the long survival of Templar ideology and the quiet relocation of people, knowledge, and purpose beyond Europe. To understand why this theory holds such power, one must first abandon the notion that the Knights Templar vanished when history says they did. Organizations rarely disappear when they are forcibly dismantled. They fracture. They adapt. They change names. The Templars, more than most, were built for survival. They were decentralized, oath-bound, and accustomed to operating across borders. When suppression came, it came from centralized authority. And centralized authority is exactly what decentralized systems are designed to outlast. By the 16th century, Europe was a hostile environment for unorthodox ideas. Religious conformity was enforced violently. Political loyalty was demanded absolutely. Knowledge outside approved doctrine was dangerous. In such a climate, preservation did not mean resistance. It meant relocation. The Atlantic Ocean offered something unprecedented: distance without disappearance. A place where ideas could survive without being visible. The New World was not simply land. It was insulation. The Templar migration theory suggests that long before Roanoke, fragments of Templar networks had already aligned themselves with maritime powers. Not as knights in armor, but as navigators, financiers, scholars, and patrons of exploration. Their symbols survived in altered form. Their methods survived intact. And their central belief, that certain knowledge must be protected from misuse, remained unchanged. Roanoke, in this interpretation, was not a beginning. It was a continuation. The settlers chosen for Roanoke were not a random cross-section of society. They included families, artisans, and individuals capable of creating continuity rather than conquest. This matters. Military colonies impose. Migratory colonies adapt. The composition of Roanoke suggests the latter. There is also the question of timing. Roanoke was established during a period of intense religious and political pressure in England. Queen Elizabeth's court was riddled with espionage, accusations of heresy, and ideological fracture. If there were groups seeking to remove themselves quietly from the center of power, the moment was ideal. The Templar migration theory does not claim that medieval knights sailed en masse to America. It claims something subtler, that their intellectual descendants, those who inherited the ethos of secrecy and preservation, used exploration as a cover for relocation. Cover matters. An official colony draws attention. A failed colony draws closure. A colony that disappears quietly draws neither. From the perspective of secrecy, failure is the perfect disguise. This would explain why Roanoke left no trace of struggle, why it was dismantled rather than destroyed, why it left behind a single coded word rather than a plea for rescue. These are not the actions of people caught off guard. They are the actions of people completing a transition. The Templars were masters of symbolic communication. They understood that symbols outlast institutions. Names change, places change, meaning endures. If Roanoke functioned symbolically rather than territorially, then its disappearance would have been part of its success. Critics argue that this theory relies too heavily on inference, that there is no document explicitly linking Roanoke to Templar ideology. But this objection misunderstands how secret traditions survive. They do not announce themselves. They leave patterns, and the patterns are striking. A powerful organization is suppressed in Europe. Its records vanish. Its treasure is never recovered. Centuries later, the same symbols and philosophies appear embedded in maritime culture. Navigation becomes sacred. Geometry becomes spiritual. Knowledge becomes guarded. And suddenly, a colony appears in the New World that disappears without violence, panic, or explanation. History asks us to believe these are unrelated. The Templar migration theory asks us to consider continuity instead. There is also the matter of legacy. If Roanoke's purpose was preservation rather than expansion, then its legacy would not be visible in monuments or borders. It would be visible in influence, subtle, indirect, and difficult to trace. This idea aligns with how later secret societies functioned in the modern world. Influence without visibility, power without declaration, survival through obscurity. America itself would later become fertile ground for such traditions. Secret societies, symbolic architecture, encoded language, and ritualized knowledge appear repeatedly in early American culture. Whether this is coincidence or inheritance is debated. But Roanoke sits uncomfortably close to the beginning of that story. Another uncomfortable detail is how thoroughly Roanoke resists closure. Most historical failures are eventually explained. New evidence emerges. Consensus forms. Roanoke does not follow this pattern. It remains suspended, as if deliberately removed from the normal flow of historical resolution. This suspension is consistent with secrecy. Secrets are not meant to be solved by those outside them. The Templar migration theory does not require belief in hidden treasure or mystical relics buried in a new world. It requires only recognition that knowledge can be considered dangerous, and that people have always gone to great lengths to protect what they believe must survive. Whether that knowledge was philosophical, spiritual, or simply cultural, the motivation remains plausible. The most unsettling implication of this theory is not that the Templars survived, but that history, as we are taught it, may be structured to hide continuity. That suppression does not erase influence. It redirects it. If Roanoke was part of such a redirection, then its disappearance was not an end. It was a transfer of people, a transfer of identity, a transfer of purpose. This reframes the mystery entirely. The question is no longer what happened to Roanoke, but what did Roanoke become part of? And that question has no simple answer, by design. The Templar migration theory remains controversial because it challenges the foundation of accepted history. It suggests that some movements operate beyond the reach of kings, churches, and archives. That some stories are not lost, but hidden inside others. Roanoke may be one such story, not a tragedy buried by time, but a success concealed by silence. And if that is true, then the greatest trick Roanoke ever played was convincing the world it had vanished at all. At the heart of the Roanoke mystery lies a revelation that is both simple and unsettling. The colony was never truly lost. It was transformed. Everything we have examined, the silence, the lack of violence, the coded language, the missing records, the oral traditions, the strange indifference of the crown, points not toward catastrophe, but toward completion. Roanoke did not fail in chaos. It concluded in secrecy. History teaches us to expect loss to look a certain way. We expect ruins, bodies, desperate messages, and unanswered cries for help. Roanoke offers none of these. Instead, it presents calm, order, intention. These are not the fingerprints of tragedy. They're the fingerprints of a plan carried out successfully. The greatest mistake modern interpretation makes is assuming that Roanoke shared our definition of success. From a colonial perspective, success meant permanence, visibility, and expansion. But from a strategic or esoteric perspective, success could mean survival without attention, preservation without confrontation, continuity without conquest. When judged by these standards, Roanoke does not appear lost at all. It appears complete. The settlers dismantled their homes rather than abandoning them. They left behind no distress signal. They carved a single word, not a plea, not a warning, but a marker. They disappeared into networks already in motion, guided by routes, alliances, and understandings that never entered official records. This is not speculation built on imagination. It is inference built on absence. Absence that is too consistent, too clean, too deliberate to be accidental. If Roanoke had been destroyed, England would have remembered. If it had starved, evidence would have remained. If it had been attacked, someone would have spoken. But Roanoke left behind only enough information to suggest departure, not demise. This forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Disappearance does not always mean failure. Sometimes it means escape. The settlers of Roanoke were not victims of circumstance. They were participants in a transition. Whether driven by ideology, survival, secrecy, or purpose, they chose invisibility over endurance in plain sight. They chose integration over dominance. They chose silence over legacy. This choice runs counter to everything empire values. Empires require records. They require borders. They require triumphs and failures clearly labeled. Roanoke refused to fit. And because it refused, it was set aside. The great reveal of Roanoke is not a dramatic discovery of hidden ruins or secret documents. It is a reframing of perspective. The reveal is realizing that we have been asking the wrong question for centuries. Not what happened to the colony, but why did it choose not to be found? Once this question is asked, the pieces align. Sir Walter Raleigh's silence stops feeling negligent and starts feeling deliberate. John White's restrained response stops feeling helpless and starts feeling knowing. The Crown's lack of pursuit stops feeling indifferent and starts feeling complicit, or at least informed. Roanoke was allowed to vanish because it was meant to. This does not require a single controlling authority. It requires only shared understanding that the colony had served its purpose, that drawing attention would undo what had been accomplished, that survival depended on forgetting. Even the myths that followed served a purpose. By labeling Roanoke lost, history neutralized it. Lost things inspire curiosity, but not accountability. Lost things are tragic, not threatening. Lost things do not force reconsideration of power structures. A colony that deliberately dissolved would have been far more dangerous to the story of empire. The settlers did not leave monuments because monuments attract questions. They did not leave bodies because bodies demand answers. They left ambiguity because ambiguity protects. This is the great reveal. Roanoke succeeded by becoming something history was not designed to track. It became invisible, and invisibility, in certain contexts, is the highest form of success. This reframing also explains why Roanoke continues to haunt the imagination. It resists closure because it was never meant to be closed. It sits at the edge of recorded history, reminding us that not all human activity seeks recognition. Some seek survival. Some seeks continuity. Some seeks to pass quietly into the future without announcing itself. Roanoke may have been one of the earliest examples of this philosophy enacted on a societal scale. A community that chose to step out of the written record rather than be shaped by it. And in doing so, it revealed something profound about history itself. History is not a complete account of the past. It is a curated narrative of what remained visible. Roanoke challenges that narrative by demonstrating that disappearance can be intentional, effective, and enduring. The colony was not lost. It was absorbed. It was preserved. It was completed. And once we accept this, Roanoke stops being a failure at the edge of history and becomes something far more unsettling. Proof that entire communities can choose to exit the story and succeed in doing so. That is the true mystery, and that is the truth history was never meant to tell us. Even after centuries of silence, Roanoke has not truly faded. Its presence lingers, not as a resolved chapter of colonial history, but as a subtle influence woven into the fabric of what would eventually become America. Like an echo that continues long after the sound has stopped, Roanoke reverberates through symbols, myths, and structures that emerged much later, often in ways that are easy to overlook. If Roanoke did not end in destruction, but instead dissolved into continuity, then its influence would not appear as a monument or a record. It would appear indirectly, through ideas, patterns, and cultural habits that seem to emerge without a clear origin. This is exactly what we find. America's early identity is saturated with paradox. It presents itself as a new beginning, yet it is filled with ancient symbolism. It claims transparency, yet relies heavily on secrecy. It celebrates independence, yet it is structured around networks of power that operate quietly behind public institutions. These contradictions are often attributed to Enlightenment thought or European inheritance, but Roanoke complicates this explanation. Roanoke represents an earlier moment when disappearance, rather than domination, shaped the land. One of the most striking echoes appears in America's relationship with secrecy itself. From the earliest days of the Republic, secret societies played a visible yet unexplained role. Fraternal orders, closed initiations, symbolic architecture, and coded language were not fringe phenomena. They were central. Founders openly acknowledged involvement in organizations that valued discretion, ritual, and inherited knowledge. This culture did not emerge in a vacuum. It reflects a deep familiarity with the idea that power does not need to be loud to be effective, that influence is often strongest when it is unseen, that continuity matters more than recognition. These are the same principles that appear to have governed Roanoke's disappearance. American frontier mythology also carries Roanoke's shadow. The frontier is portrayed as empty, waiting to be claimed, yet it was never empty. It was layered with histories that were absorbed, overwritten, or forgotten. The idea that people could vanish into the land without trace feels strangely familiar within American storytelling. From lost towns to unexplained settlements, the theme of disappearance recurs. These stories are often framed as mysteries, but rarely explored as intentional acts. Roanoke may have established a precedent, a quiet lesson in how to survive by blending rather than conquering. There is also the matter of identity. America has always struggled with the question of who belongs. It is a nation built on movement, migration, and reinvention. Names change, origins blur, lineages disappear into anonymity. This fluidity of identity mirrors the integration hypothesis surrounding Roanoke. In a sense, America itself behaves like a society that chose to forget its beginnings in order to move forward. Even the way American history is taught reflects this tension. Certain narratives are emphasized, others are minimized or labeled unresolved. Roanoke is one of the earliest examples of this pattern. It is introduced, then abandoned, mentioned, then left unexplored. This treatment is not accidental. It reflects discomfort. Roanoke undermines the idea that European presence in America followed a clear trajectory from exploration to settlement to dominance. It suggests an alternative path, one of adaptation, integration, and disappearance. That path does not fit comfortably within narratives of manifest destiny or progress, and so it lingers at the margins. There are also symbolic echoes worth noting. America's fascination with beginnings, the first colony, the first child born in the New World, the first settlement, reveals a deep anxiety about origin. Roanoke represents a beginning that refused to become a foundation. It complicates the story of how America began. Perhaps this is why Roanoke continues to inspire art, literature, and speculation. It is not just a mystery of the past. It is a mirror, It reflects America's own uncertainty about itself. If Roanoke survived by disappearing, then America's obsession with visibility, records, borders, declarations, may be a reaction against that possibility. A need to assert presence where once there was silence. Yet silence persists, in the gaps between official narratives, in the persistence of oral traditions, in the repeated emergence of secrecy as a cultural value, in the way power often operates most effectively when it is least visible. These are Roanoke's echoes. They do not demand belief in a single theory. They invite recognition of a pattern in which survival is not always loud, and success is not always documented. Modern America is full of such patterns. Communities that adapt rather than resist. Cultures that blend rather than dominate. Identities that change rather than disappear. Roanoke may have been an early expression of this approach, a quiet experiment in continuity that left no instructions, only an example. As time passes, the echo grows fainter, but it never fully disappears. Because the conditions that produced Roanoke have never truly gone away. Secrecy remains useful. Integration remains powerful. Disappearance remains an option. The legacy of Roanoke is not a cautionary tale about failure. It is a reminder that history does not belong exclusively to those who leave the loudest traces. Some legacies are carried forward invisibly, shaping the future without ever announcing their presence. And in that sense, Roanoke may be one of the most American stories of all, not because it ended, but because it never truly did. Roanoke does not simply challenge our understanding of one vanished colony. It challenges our understanding of history itself. After centuries of investigation, speculation, and frustration, the enduring power of Roanoke lies not in its unanswered questions, but in the way those questions expose the limits of how history is written, remembered, and trusted. We are taught to think of history as a record of events, dates, names, outcomes. We expect clarity. We expect cause and effect. When something resists this structure, we label it a mystery and move on. Roanoke refuses to be so easily contained. It exposes the uncomfortable truth that history is not a neutral archive of everything that happened, but a selective narrative shaped by power, survival, and intent. What Roanoke teaches us first is that absence is not ignorance. Absence can be evidence. When something is missing consistently across records, generations, and disciplines, that absence begins to speak. In Roanoke's case, what speaks loudest is not destruction, but restraint. The restraint of those who left no panic. The restraint of those who did not pursue answers. The restraint of a historical system that allowed the event to fade without resistance. This forces us to reconsider the idea that history is always accidental. Some outcomes are chosen, some endings are planned, and some stories are designed to disappear because their continuation would be inconvenient. Roanoke also teaches us that history favors visibility. Empires reward what can be measured, mapped, and claimed. What survives visibly is remembered. What survives invisibly is ignored. This bias shapes everything from textbooks to monuments. It ensures that domination looks like progress, while adaptation looks like failure. But adaptation is often the more intelligent response. If the settlers of Roanoke chose to integrate rather than impose, to dissolve rather than conquer, then their choice contradicts the dominant narrative of colonial history. It suggests that survival did not require victory. It required humility, cooperation, and silence. History does not know how to honor such choices. Another lesson Roanoke offers is that written records are not synonymous with truth. Writing has always been a tool of power. It preserves what authorities want preserved and excludes what threatens coherence. Oral traditions, silence, and disappearance exist outside this system. They do not compete with written history, they undermine it. This is why Roanoke remains unresolved. Resolving it would require accepting forms of continuity that leave no paperwork. Roanoke also reminds us that intent matters more than outcome. If the intent of the colony was not permanence, then judging it by permanence guarantees misunderstanding. We often judge the past by standards it never shared. When it fails those standards, we assume failure. Roanoke exposes how misleading that assumption can be. History is not only shaped by what people did, but by why they did it. And intent is the easiest thing to lose when records vanish. There is also a deeper philosophical lesson. Roanoke confronts us with the possibility that not everything seeks to be remembered. Modern culture assumes that legacy is the goal of all action, but many societies valued continuity over recognition. They measured success not by visibility, but by survival across generations. In this light, disappearance becomes a strategy, not a tragedy. Roanoke unsettles us because it denies closure. It denies moral resolution. There is no villain to blame, no hero to rescue, no disaster to mourn conclusively. It exists in a liminal space where outcomes blur and categories collapse. History prefers certainty. Roanoke offers ambiguity, and ambiguity is dangerous. It invites questions about other stories we assume are settled. It invites us to wonder how many communities survived by stepping outside the historical record. How many decisions were made quietly to avoid attention? How many legacies exist without names? Roanoke is not unique because it vanished. It is unique because it reminds us how often vanishing works. The final lesson Roanoke teaches us is humility. The past does not owe us explanations. It does not exist to satisfy our curiosity. Some truths remain hidden not because they were lost, but because they were protected. When we encounter silence, the correct response may not be to force meaning, but to listen differently. History, in the end, is not a complete story. It is a partial one, a story shaped by what endured, what was allowed, and what was safe to remember. Roanoke stands at the edge of that story, reminding us that beyond the written page lies another past, one that chose not to be seen. And perhaps that choice was the greatest act of agency the colony ever made. Roanoke ends not with an answer, but with a pause. And perhaps that pause is the most honest conclusion history can offer. After all the theories, documents, symbols, and silences, we are left standing where John White once stood, facing an absence that refuses to explain itself. Yet absence does not mean emptiness. It means restraint. It means intention. It means something chose not to speak. Modern storytelling trains us to expect resolution. Mysteries are meant to be solved. Questions are meant to be closed. Roanoke defies this expectation because it does not belong to us in the way we want it to. It belongs to the people who lived it, and they did not leave the kind of ending we recognize. They left a silence shaped like a boundary. What makes Roanoke so powerful is not that it vanished, but that it vanished completely enough to survive untouched by conquest, interpretation, or ownership. It escaped the machinery of history by refusing to remain visible. And in doing so, it revealed something unsettling about how fragile our historical confidence truly is. We like to believe that if something mattered, it would have been recorded. Roanoke tells us that what matters most may be what avoids being recorded at all. The settlers left no ruins to be claimed, no narrative to be shaped, no victory or defeat to be absorbed into empire. They left only uncertainty, and uncertainty is the one thing power cannot easily use. This is why Roanoke still lingers. It has not been absorbed into national mythology the way Jamestown or Plymouth have. It sits apart, unresolved, uncomfortable. It cannot be celebrated, and it cannot be condemned. It exists in a space history prefers to ignore, because it challenges the idea that progress must always move forward in straight lines. Roanoke reminds us that history is not a complete map of the past. It is a trail of what remained visible. What vanished successfully does not appear on that map. And yet, those vanished paths may have carried people, cultures, and decisions that shaped the future in ways we cannot easily trace. Perhaps the settlers of Roanoke understood this. Perhaps they knew that survival did not always mean endurance under a single name or place. Perhaps they believed that the safest future was one that did not announce itself. If so, then Roanoke was not a tragedy. It was a choice to step out of the story. As listeners, readers, and seekers of hidden history, we must be careful not to demand answers the past never promised to give. Some histories were not meant to be recovered. Some truths were protected by silence rather than stone. Roanoke may be one of those truths, and yet its lesson remains.